I got out of the hospital a few months ago, but I can't forget about the Stump. I never ran past the Stump. Never. Except for once. The Stump had been there for years, at the edge of where I turned around on my runs. Right at that point where I knew I would have a hard time getting back without walking. Except for that day. Last spring around noon on a Saturday. Gentle breeze, high 70s. The sun dipping behind the clouds every few minutes. Perfect weather. Something about the daylight had always made me feel insecure. It was the night we were always supposed to be wary of. The shadows and the silence, when the bugs would stop making noises. That's when you were supposed to worry. That's when the hairs were supposed to raise. When everything felt wrong. Not during the day, though. Not when everything was supposed to be safe. That was never how I worked, though. I was always wary of the daytime growing up. I never had nightmares at night. My nightmares were during nap times, during the day, when everyone else thought that the world was safe. I grew up as a cautious type of kid. I was afraid of a lot of things. Being alone used to matter so much more. I slept in my parents' bed until I was 4 or 5, and even after that I felt uneasy sleeping alone. Most kids feel safe if they bundle up enough in their blankets, but I never felt safe. I always felt as if I were laying on an island surrounded by evil, and nothing I could do could protect me from that. Back in high school, running was easier. I could eat what I wanted and run whenever I felt like. My run times really never got affected by those things. I was a quick kid, too. I was running low 5-minute miles. One time, I even ran a 4:50 mile. Not really competition speeds for college, but pretty good for a kid who just enjoyed going to city runs on the weekends. I used to imagine myself as a gazelle, running from a cheetah or some other large cat. The cats win, sometimes, but the gazelle has form over power, grace over strength. When chased, the gazelle will take every step with the intent to survive, that need to live. That was the past. After all that time running 6-minute miles hurt, I became more of a 7-minute mile type, which was fine. I wasn't racing anymore, just doing it for fun. For me, running had always been a form of meditation. About a mile or so into a run, everything would loosen up, and it would become easier to stride out. The stress on the body always felt good and pushed my mind to concentrate on the moment, to decompress, to re-evaluate. On that Saturday, everything felt right. Everything was more than fine. It was the perfect day. I was approaching the Stump and I felt amazing. The best I had felt on a run in years. Years. I approached the Stump and I hurtled like a track star. I didn't feel like I scraped anything. It was a clean jump, but I still heard a scratching sound. I didn't turn back. I was just in the zone. Birds and other animals in the woods were common on my runs. I ended up running another mile into the woods. I had never been that deep in. I was probably around 5 miles from the house when I saw a bit of smoke in the distance. I knew that there were other trails in the woods, but the trail I used was the nice one, the trail that the sun could touch almost all day. It was a cottage. That's where the smoke was coming from. The random cottage's chimney out deep in the woods. Totally not fit for anything to live in, but there it was. Something about the way the house sat on its foundation made it seem to be twisted, somehow abnormal. The windows were uncharacteristically high, almost beginning at chest level. I started to run in place, considering whether or not to keep moving forward or to turn back. The curtains in the window had some sort of floral pattern. I didn't want to trespass. I never knew who the woods really belonged to out there. Suddenly, the curtain was thrown back, and the figure behind the window was looking at me, barely peeking over the base of the windowsill. The eyes were wide. I turned and I ran toward home. It seemed so far. It took me a very long time to make it back to the woods I was familiar with. I just kept running, pumping my arms and moving my legs, breathing strong inhale, strong exhale, strong inhale, strong exhale, focus, focus, equal breathing, equal breathing. That's when I saw the stump. Except it didn't look the same. Not how I was used to seeing it. Granted, I had never approached the stump from that side before, but I knew that there was something wrong. My chest tensed up a little bit more. I slowed down to give some rest to my hips. There was some sort of lump on the tree stump that I'd never seen, some type of cancer. The closer I got, the less the lump looked like a part of the tree. It looked like some kind of matted hair, clumped and moist. I had slowed down to almost a walk. I was just a few strides away from the stump when the moist lump opened its eyes. It was some type of animal, covered in dark brown fur that almost camouflaged the stump's bark. It was only after the eyes opened that I realized both of the animal's long arms were draped over my side of the stump. The head was far behind the stump. All I could see were the eyes peeking over, like the animal was hiding from me.
Hi, Alexander. Alexander the stranger, the runner, the lone ranger. Don't look surprised. You don't remember me? We used to be so close. You slept on top of the bed, and I slept below.
It said. I looked at the arms of the animal covered in hair, powerful looking. I couldn't bring myself to speak at first. I hesitated. Are you the devil?
Oh, Alex, the devil is just a story. I am very real. I'm you. I'm not you. I'm something different. Something blue. Something better.
It said. The animal started to tap the log's bark with all of its fingers. Its way of speaking seemed to trail off on certain words in a weird, distracted tone. I need to go. I want to go home, I said. I was looking at the hands of the animal, at the claws. It was tapping its fingers against the bark. I noticed my breathing wasn't rapid. I wasn't out of breath at all from the run. Instead, I was barely breathing at all, like I kept forgetting to take another breath every few seconds. I turned my head to look back at the cottage quickly to see if anything was coming from that direction. Nothing was there. I quickly turned my head back forward to keep my eyes on the creature behind the stump.
Oh, now, Alex, don't you worry about Mother. You'll never get to meet her. You'll never get to meet her, Alex. That's what I'm here for. You shouldn't have looked. Didn't you learn never to peek under the bed, Alex? Triple X, not the sex. Not the sex. You aren't going where you want to go. This isn't the trail home. The trail of tears, the trail of fears. We're going to do something else.
It said. Up until that point, the eyes had been wondering, contemplating what the next words would be. The animal seemed to enjoy the rhymes. Every rhyme would strike some sort of emotional chord with my childhood. The shows I watched, the things I would say growing up. Then, the animal's eyes locked right into mine.
The things I'm going to do to you, Alex. Oh, oh, you haven't lived until you've... The things I will do to your innards, the belly inside. I don't want to ruin the surprise, but... Oh, the things we are going to do.
It said. I heard it clack its teeth together a few times. I swallowed and reminded myself to breathe. I made myself say something. Please don't, was all that came out. I couldn't see its mouth, but I could imagine its smile. It was in the eyes. Everything about the animal was inhuman, except for the eyes. Baby blues. They could have been my eyes. The eyes squinted a little in an expression mixed with intent.
Are you going to pee yourself? Are you going to piss? Little Alex pissed the bed, and slept in the shed. You can't hide from me, Alex. You can't run away. This is our moment together. Are you going to pee-pee, cry to mother? I used to lick it up. Every time I would lick it all up. I would suck the bed dry after a good soiling. What it must taste like after all these years. I've waited, Alex. I've waited to taste it from the source. Pure, unfiltered. I followed you for a very long time. Go ahead and do it for me. Do it for me, Alex. I just want to smell it.
The animal said. I heard it lick its lips and start clicking its teeth. I could hear them like pieces of metal clacking together. And then, the animal slowly raised its head above the stump. There was no smile, just a wide mouth of teeth, row upon row into the blackness of its throat, as if the teeth would never end once something strayed past the animal's hairy lips. No, was all I could say.
No. Oh, Alex. We know no won't go. No. I'm going to step over this stump, and you are going to let me do it. All the dreams are about to happen. Let me suck on it. Your hand, your foot, your leg, your flesh. Just a nibble, just the tips.
The animal began to laugh. Seeing the teeth, hearing the laughter, the depths of the animal's almost human voice. Scratchy, like the voice was being filtered through burning coals on a fire. My bladder let out everything. The moment that happened, the animal stopped laughing and threw its head back in the air to take in the smell. I could see its nostrils expand to an unreasonable size. Maybe it was fear. Maybe that was why. Once I realized it was going to keep its head back a moment, I shot into the edge of the woods to the right. That day was my best run in so long that I had to chance it. I had to try to escape, to run from my life. Miles. I still had miles until I would make it back home. And I wasn't on any trail. I was just running through the middle of the woods, hitting the dead pine needles with my feet, needles that were never cleared by anyone. You could have buried anything in those woods. If someone disappeared out there, that would have been it. The animal realized a few seconds after I broke the tree line that I wasn't going to wait. I didn't hear it talk, but I did hear it start moving behind me. The movement was what kept me sprinting, kept me pushing myself. I heard the legs. There seemed to be so many of them. And the trees. The animal was so strong that every few breaths I was taking, I would hear a great tree get splintered or another tree fall down. It was gaining on me. Another tree fell, and I could hear the animal breathing.
Alex.
It said. I couldn't turn around. I didn't want to. If it weren't for the terrain, I would have closed my eyes, hidden deep inside myself, and hoped to wake up alive. The breathing was so close, almost right next to my ears. I didn't want to see. I didn't want to see the moment happen. I wanted to try to fight until the very end. And that's when I found another trail. Out of nowhere, it was going in the same direction as the main trail I'd always ran down. I didn't think of anything besides getting home and escaping. I opened up my stride and I did my best to breathe correctly. Pump my arms, perfect form, not slamming my feet, not arching my back too much, staying forward, letting my core be involved. It was the most important run of my life. I was the gazelle. Breathe out. I had to be. Breathe in. I needed to be perfect. Breathe out. I needed to live. Breathe in. I knew I had a chance if I could sustain the pace, maintain, and not look back. Even on the trail, I could still hear the animal crashing through the woods behind me, as if the trail wasn't wide enough for whatever size the animal must have been. I didn't want to think about how massive it was, how easily the animal was going to tear me apart, how my skin was going to feel sliding off my bones. I tried to keep my mind on the run, on the breathing, on staying consistent, pushing off with each step long strides. I could make it if I kept the form, kept the breathing, ignored the pain in my shins and my thighs, how my hamstrings were starting to pull with the strain I was putting myself under, forcing myself to open up my stride. I was past muscle failure when I ran past the stump. I wasn't sure how I was doing what I was doing, but I knew I wanted to live, knew that if I kept that in my mind, I could do it. I was so close. I saw the edge of the woods, and there was maybe a quarter of a mile before I was out. I wasn't sure how I'd never seen the trail I was on. It appeared that the trail would connect with the main trail before the end. I was there. I was going to make it. The animal kept running after me. It must have had so many legs, smashing through the bushes and tearing apart all the trees. 10 feet away from the wood line, I took a step, but my foot didn't land right. The animal had caught me by grabbing a hold of my foot. I was pulled to the ground. My head hit something while I was being flipped upside down. The animal raised me up to its face and spoke.
Alex, I love games. I told you that you couldn't run. Was that torture for you? I let you get this far.
The animal's tongue came out of its mouth. Long and grotesque, the tongue slipped down my shorts to taste the urine. It was a violating sensation. Sandpaper. If I hadn't already done so, I would have urinated myself again.
Salty,
the animal said. I was shaking. There's a certain type of anticipation that the body experiences when the mind knows everything is about to end. I could feel it in the back of my neck, a kind of tingle. Instead of forgetting to breathe, I couldn't get enough air. My lungs were a vacuum. I was upside down but raised high enough to be eye level with the animal. The creature was something old and eternal. The hair matted in odd places, patches of scales, sharp joints of a being that should have died when the planet was young. My heart ached to be so close to home, but instead be looking at true evil. The monster, the devil, to see the matted hair and the black line over the blue eyes.
Oh, Alex, sweetie, no tears. Now, do stop screaming. No one can hear you in this terrible dream,
the animal said. The smell was too complicated for human noses to understand. It was disgusting and as hot as a furnace. My skin felt tighter after each breath from the creature. And the animal was right. I was screaming. I didn't even realize it. My mind was in so many places I couldn't think of anything to do. I was trapped. Caught. Please! The only word I managed to get out.
Don't mind if I do, boy.
What happened next was so fast. I was instantly flipped right side up and watched as the animal opened its mouth wide. All those teeth seemed to be infinite, an impossibly deep throat. A part of my mind thought I was looking into hell itself. There was no fire, just the heat of it. There was only teeth. The animal's tongue slid out of its mouth and wrapped around my leg and drifted up. I tried to struggle away, but there was nowhere to go in that amount of time. I saw my leg slowly being pulled into the mouth. The end. I closed my eyes. My skin slid off the bone like the icicle on a popsicle stick. I felt the tug, the pressure, and then heard a pop and feeling of release. At first, I couldn't tell if the fire that shot up my leg was the heat from the animal's mouth or the pain. It was searing. I couldn't help but look, see what had happened. I was bleeding everywhere, so much blood drenching the animal's face. I realized why the animal's fur was all matted. It had its eyes closed, enjoying the blood spraying all over it. Half of my leg was gone, disappeared in the animal's mouth. The pain was everywhere, and I was surprised that I had not immediately gone into shock. I knew that I needed to keep my head together. I needed to concentrate. Then I heard the crunching. The animal started to chew. It was eating my leg. It dropped me to the ground. It seemed to be caught up in the sensation, like it hadn't eaten in years, and maybe it hadn't. I didn't care. I needed to escape. I needed to get home. Home. I was almost in my backyard. I was 10 feet away. There was so much blood. I knew I had only a few minutes, maybe seconds. I needed to get to my backyard. I needed to crawl. I rolled over to my stomach and I moved every remaining limb as fast as I could.
No. Stop.
The animal's mouth was full. I had the notion that it didn't want to stop chewing. It paused, as if to decide whether it should just enjoy what it had or to catch me. Maybe it paused intentionally. By the time the animal made the decision to lunge at me, I had rolled the rest of the way into my backyard. I had done it. I made it back. I rolled to my back. I knew I needed to stop bleeding. Seconds mattered. I ripped off all of my clothes and tore them to tie a tourniquet. I pulled the knots tight and covered the stump that remained of my leg. My heart was still beating. I needed to hydrate. I needed to get to a doctor. I laid on my back at the edge of my backyard, having saved myself from the animal that chased me through the woods. I passed out. I woke up an instant later. Maybe it was hours, I couldn't tell with the sun. I looked over. Maybe it had all just been a dream, a nightmare, and I had dehydrated on my run. It was a relieving feeling, but after a moment the clouds in my head started to clear. It wasn't a dream. At the edge of the woods, it was there, peeking behind a tree, somehow hiding the true size of itself. The animal. It was dangling a shredded running shoe in one of its hands. My running shoe. I heard a slow crunching sound, a steady chewing. The animal was still chewing on my bones. It began to speak again, except its voice had changed to the voice of my mother.
Alex, wake up, sweetheart. It's time to go outside and play. Go off and play in the woods. Don't you want to come back, honey? Do come back. Maybe tomorrow? Yes? Get your 5 miles in. Get your 10 miles in. I'll see you then, dear. I will see you then.
I never could figure out what made the animal stop, how it wasn't able to move past the wood line, or even how I knew I would be safe if I made it to my backyard. I wasn't really under my bed as a child. The cottage. Mother. I didn't understand. I crawled back to my house. The bleeding had slowed, but the bandages were soaked through with my blood. I was really lightheaded. I thought I was going to pass out again when I had to push the sliding glass door open. I managed to make a phone call before passing out again. The doctors didn't know what to think. I told them it was a gator that got me. No one would have believed anything else. No one questioned me further with that information either. People rarely show up at an ER with a leg bitten off. No doctor would have the experience to really question my story anyways. I have never gone back in the woods, never even thought about it. I could never go back. Sometimes, if I wake up before the sun rises, I'll be drinking my coffee, and right when the sun hits the tree line, I'll see it. The animal, peeking out behind a tree. Never the same tree. What is left of my leg will always ache, and I'll feel the sensation of being lowered into the animal's mouth again. And the tip of my leg feels that fire. The tip of my stump. Once the twilight of morning is past, the animal will duck behind whatever it's hiding behind and disappear. It never speaks. It never does anything else but look at me. I never see the animal's teeth, but I don't ever have to.
I was tucking my little sister into bed when she spoke up. "Can you sit with me until I fall asleep?" "Why?" I asked. "I thought you weren't afraid of the dark." "It's not the dark," Charlotte said. "It's the Twisted Lady." A chill shot down my spine. "Who?" "The Twisted Lady," my sister repeated. "She comes into my room and watches me as I sleep." Wordlessly, I lay down beside Charlotte and held her close. She fell asleep within minutes, but I stared up at the dark ceiling and tried to make sense of what I'd just heard. The Twisted Lady. I knew that name. When I was 3, I used to talk about a gnarled-looking woman who lived in the basement and only came out at night. I described her as having white eyes and a face like a skeleton. My parents assumed it was just a recurring nightmare and got a nightlight for my room. That seemed to help, and I grew up believing the Twisted Lady had been nothing more than a construct of my imagination. But now, 15 years later, my 7-year-old sister had seen her too. I stayed up with Charlotte all night, my sleep restless and uneasy. The next morning, I asked my mom if she told my sister about the Twisted Lady. "No, of course not. I wouldn't want to scare her." "Well, she was talking about her last night, though." "She must have overheard us discussing it." Mom's lips thinned with worry. "Oh, dear, I hope she doesn't start having nightmares like you did." That day, I could barely concentrate in school. I kept sifting through my memories, trying to find an image of the Twisted Lady. I was unsuccessful. When I got home, I searched the internet for clues, but nothing solid came up. All too soon, night rolled around again, and I stood outside Charlotte's door, listening to her speak with Mom. "The Twisted Lady will come. Honey, there's no such thing as a Twisted Lady.
Trust me, you're completely safe. She's real, Mama,
Charlotte insisted. The desperation in her voice brought stinging tears to my eyes.
She really is. Honey, go to sleep, okay? It's going to be okay, I promise.
She kissed my sister and walked out of the room. When she saw me standing in the hall, she gave me a reassuring smile and said, "Everything's okay." But it wasn't. Charlotte woke up that night screaming. "She was in here," she wailed when I burst into a room, my parents shadowing me. "The twisted lady was in here." I picked her up and rocked her. "It's okay, sweetie. You're safe with us." She sobbed as our parents came over and wrapped their arms around us both. We sat there hugging until Charlotte dozed off again. After tucking her back in, we went to bed, but I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. And that was just the beginning. A pattern emerged over the next 2 months. At least one night a week, Charlotte would scream out at night and insist that the twisted lady had been in her room. We would calm her and she would go back to sleep, only for it to happen again, a night or two later next week. Soon the physical effects of the nightmares became apparent. Plum-colored circles formed around Charlotte's pretty blue eyes. Her face was perpetually as pale as unbaked bread dough, and she moved as if her legs were too heavy for the rest of her body. She could barely stay awake, and we were all worried that she was only going to get worse. I still wasn't sure if I believed whether or not the twisted lady was real. I'm not really a skeptic, but I'd rather rule out all rational explanations before believing that there are paranormal forces at work. Also, I was afraid. I couldn't remember the twisted lady herself, but I did remember the terror she planted in me. A terror that seemed never to have left us after all. One night, on a weekend my parents were out of town, I came up with a plan. What if I could get physical proof that the twisted lady wasn't real? If Charlotte saw it herself, maybe the nightmares would stop. If she knew the twisted lady wasn't real, she wouldn't have to be afraid. I set up my father's camcorder in Charlotte's room, explaining to her that if the twisted lady came by, the device would pick her up. I then took my baby sister into my own room, and we crawled into bed and fell asleep. I woke up extremely early, just as the sun began to bleed through the hazy lavender sky. Rubbing my eyes, I stumbled into the hall, and my heart flew into my throat when I saw that Charlotte's door was open. I was sure I'd closed it the night before. Moving as quietly as I could in my slightly panicked state, I grabbed the camcorder and went downstairs to the living room, where I uploaded the video onto my laptop and sat on the couch to watch. The first few hours of footage were uneventful and showed nothing, which only added to my mounting dread. At around midnight, something could be heard shuffling awkwardly up the stairs. By the time it reached the hall, I was shaking, and I'd nearly bitten through the bottom of my lip. Very, very slowly, Charlotte's door squeaked open, and the most horrifying thing I have ever seen entered into my sister's room. It was a woman, a naked woman, who looked like nearly every bone in her body had been broken and then reset by the most incompetent doctors. She crab-walked on limbs bent sharply at bizarre angles, and her chest caved in as if she was missing whole sections of her ribs. Her spine and shoulders curved inward, forming a camel-like bump on the back and pushing her head down between her breasts. And the sounds she was making. Oh God, it was a deep, raspy, guttural noise, caught somewhere between a moan and a gasp, and it made me want to claw my own ears off. She shuffled right up to Charlotte's bed and sat there for a while, as if not sure what to do next. Then, slowly, she began to turn her head, neck cracking loudly with the movement. Her long, stringy hair fell back as she looked right at the camera. Her face, to put it mildly, was grotesque. The skin was so taut I could see every contour of her skull and facial bones, and her eyes were rolled all the way back in her head, stark white. She had no visible lips, and her nose seemed to be caving in. I slammed the laptop shut and ran upstairs. After searching Charlotte's room and finding no sign of the monstrosity I'd just seen, I grabbed my still sleeping sister and fled to my best friend's house. I was in shock. I couldn't quite process what had just happened. That was 3 years ago. Charlotte hadn't seen the Twisted Lady in a long time, and I never showed my parents the footage. In fact, I deleted it. I didn't want what I'd seen to be real. But now I'm not so sure I made the right choice. You see, a month ago, my father was doing some homework in the basement when he discovered that some bricks in the wall had come loose. Further investigation revealed a makeshift grave where a broken human skeleton lay. The police haven't been able to identify the victim, but I know she's connected to the Twisted Lady. Since the discovery, past owners of the house have come forward and admitted to seeing her too. None of them imagined she was a possible murder victim. Then again, neither did my family. Looking back, I believe the Twisted Lady only wanted help. She wanted to tell someone who she was and what had happened to her, but she was unable to convey any of this. If I hadn't been such a coward and gotten rid of the footage, maybe her bones could have been discovered sooner. I hope they catch her killer, so that the sick bastard can be brought to justice. And I hope once he's been brought to justice, the Twisted Lady can finally be at peace.
I have nightmares where I'm trapped in a shower. The drain is plugged and the water won't stop pouring down on me. Water rises to my ankles, to my waist, and then over my head. The shower curtain turns to glass and my screams turn to gargles. A dark figure presses its face against the glass on the other side and it watches me. I plead, but it won't let me out. I swallow water and flail helplessly in my glass coffin. I wake up gagging. I know where the nightmare came from. I never have to dig deep. The incident is never far from my subconscious. Finding it is easy. Getting over it is not. It was the summer of my 12th birthday when the Hudsons moved in across the street. 3 people, one of them a really old woman. She was tiny, frail, skeletal almost. Thin white hair, faded, blue flowery dress. Her head hung from her neck and it wobbled as the man pushed her up a makeshift wheelchair ramp into the house. At the time I couldn't figure out if she was alive or dead. A few minutes later she appeared in an upstairs window, sitting in her wheelchair. She was directly facing my bedroom, and I cautiously peered out from behind my curtains. Her head was upright now and she stared at me. Just stared, without moving her head an inch. I closed my drapes. For days she sat at the window. She watched the cars putter down our suburban road and gazed at the neighborhood kids scurrying through their yards. I never saw anyone else in the room, never saw her move from that wheelchair. At night, I'd nervously peek through the cracks in my drapes. Her silhouette was still in that window, lights off, staring out into the darkness at my bedroom. I couldn't tell, but I knew she was watching me. The stories about her cropped up pretty quick amongst my friends in the neighborhood. That she was a witch, that she was just a doll, that she was actually dead. But I knew she wasn't dead. Sure, I never saw her move from that window, not once, and I never saw her head turn, but I felt her eyes move as they studied me. I could feel her watching me. All alone in my bedroom in the middle of the night with my drapes firmly shut, I'd wake up and shudder. Her eyes were on me. I just knew it. I began sleeping on the floor. The lower I was, the better. Maybe she couldn't see me if I was on the floor. I told my parents that the old woman across the street was creeping me out. I pleaded with them to talk to the Hudsons and asked them to move her to a room without a window. They laughed and told me to let her live out her twilight years in peace. She was just watching the street, they said, and that probably made her feel happy and feel younger. Are you just going to stick me in a windowless room when I'm an old lady? My mom laughed. Remind me to move in with your sister when I'm in a wheelchair. A week later, there was some commotion at the Hudsons. I watched from my bedroom window as the man ran out of the house and opened up the double doors of his van. He jogged inside and he reappeared minutes later pushing the old woman in her wheelchair down the ramp. She looked frailer than before. She couldn't have weighed more than 70 pounds. Her head was flung to the side, resting on her right shoulder. Her body jostled in the wheelchair. But her eyes never left me, watched me the whole time. The man picked her up and placed her in the car. He folded the wheelchair and stuffed it in the trunk. He quickly hopped into the driver's seat. The younger woman pounced into the passenger seat and the man put his foot to the pedal. The old woman's limp head still faced me. It bobbed up and down as the van reversed down the driveway. I studied her face. It was expressionless, emotionless. Her tongue slightly hung from the right side of her mouth, but her eyes were on mine and they stayed on me. The van accelerated down the street and it was gone. My parents heard the news that afternoon from other neighbors. The old woman's condition was getting worse and the Hudsons had taken her to some sort of home. She wouldn't be back. I went straight to my bedroom and I looked across the street. I smiled. Her window was finally empty. The Hudsons didn't come back the next day. No van. That night I looked out towards the old woman's window. There was no one there, no wheelchair, but the bedroom light was on. I remember telling my dad I thought it was strange and he just shrugged and said, "Must be some sort of timer or something." I woke up in the middle of the night and nervously peered out my bedroom window. That bedroom light was still on. It suddenly flicked off and I ducked below my window frame. I slowly rose and looked out, expecting to see the silhouette of that tiny skeletal being. I watched for 10 minutes, pinching and straining my eyes. The lights quickly flickered on and then off again. I slept on the floor again, clutching my pillow close. I had a late baseball practice that next evening. When I got home, my house was empty. My parents were at my little sister's softball game. I needed a shower to rinse off. About 3 minutes into my shower, I felt cold. The hot steam was escaping the bathroom somehow, which didn't make sense because I had shut the door. I wiped the shampoo from my eyes, turned my head, and I heard a strange noise that would haunt me in my nightmares for years. The metal rings of the shower curtain being dragged across the shower rod. Someone was slowly opening the curtain. The shampoo stung my eyes, and through the stinging I saw a dark figure behind the curtains. Long, pale, bony fingers gripped the curtain as it slowly opened. I instinctively backed up into the shower and the curtain opened completely. There stood the old woman. I must have only looked at her for 1, maybe 2 seconds, but at that moment time stood still. All these years later, I can still draw you a vivid picture of the horrifying image in front of me. Disheveled white hair, crazy in her eyes, bones jutting out from under her stretched skin, stark naked. Blotchy skin, warts all over her body, skinny breasts hanging to her waist, hair where I didn't know people could grow hair. She smiled grotesquely, and I felt the shower tile against my back and the hot water pound my face. In her other hand, the old woman held a letter open.
August,
she mumbled.
August, August, August.
I leaped past her, knocking her tiny body to the floor. I ran downstairs, naked and sopping wet. In my panic, I somehow remembered I was nude and I yanked a pair of shorts out from the hamper in the laundry room, sending the hamper crashing to the floor. I hightailed it on foot down the street, eventually winding up at my friend's house. When the police arrived, they found the old woman, crumpled to a heap in the bathroom. The shower was still running. The policemen were all really nice to me, admiring me for my bravery. I told them what she said to me, August, and asked if they knew what she could have meant. "It will be August in a few days," one of them shrugged. "And you never really fully understand old and crazy, son." The Hudsons only came to our street once more to retrieve their stuff. The for sale sign was up in days. My mom told me they couldn't face the neighbors for what happened. Apparently, they had taken the old woman, the man's mother, to a special home downstate. Somehow, some way, the woman managed to escape the home and caught a bus back to our town. It never quite made sense to me. She was so old, so frail, so helpless. She could barely move those weeks she lived in that house. How had she managed to travel hundreds of miles on her own? Anyway, you can imagine what this did to me. I didn't shower for 21 years. I took baths, which I suppose aren't that different. It's still a tub and it's involving hot, soapy water. But a shower with its closed curtain, water peppering the tub floor, and steam climbing the walls. You get lost in your own head in the shower. Thoughts consume you, and it feels so utterly safe. For a few minutes you are alone from the world. It's your own private, misty kingdom. But that's what makes the shower dangerous. You're enclosed, vulnerable, naked. You're exposed. I talked to people about it, my parents, a shrink. But mainly I tried to push the incident deep down into places where I couldn't find it. I didn't talk about it with anyone since I was a kid, and life carried on. Besides the baths, I was pretty normal. A few months ago, something inside me clicked. I felt the urge to re-examine the incident, and it was almost like a voice in my head was telling me to do it. My head wanted closure. I spent hours online one night, trying to track down any information on the Hudsons and the old woman. I finally found what I was looking for, an obituary for the old woman. She had died 4 years ago. Somehow that walking skeleton hadn't checked out for another 15 years. The obituary photo was a black and white picture from when she was a young woman. It was a photo of her and her deceased husband on their wedding day. His name was August, and he looked exactly like me. I closed the browser and stared at my computer desktop for 10 minutes. It finally made more sense. Why she called me August. Why she was obsessed with watching me. Maybe she used to write letters to her husband, and that's why she was clutching the letter opener that night. For a small moment, I felt a little better. Things always felt better when they make more sense. "Honey, is everything okay?" It was my wife. "I think so," I said. I took the first shower I had taken in years that night. I didn't even jump when the curtain rungs dragged across the shower rod and my wife entered. But as she embraced me under the hot water, one question wouldn't leave my head. How come the young woman in that wedding photo looks exactly like my wife?
I apologize for the length of this account. I have tried to preserve the sense of my memory as well as the factual details as sparingly as possible without destroying their effect. Rather than segment this story into separate posts, I've marked it into 3 parts with page breaks for your ease in reading it, if you want to read one part and revisit the rest later. In editing, I've gone through and omitted from this story all the names of localities for the sake of not embarrassing small communities by reassociating them with painful events from their past. To give you some sense of the geography where it all occurred, the events described below took place in a rural community between Lima, Ohio, and Fort Wayne, Indiana. Growing up as I did in a cozy college town in central Ohio, my childhood visits to my grandmother's home in the country were always a mixed blessing for me. She lived in a small, one-story home along a country road nestled amongst the farms of western Ohio. While I loved visiting my grandmother, the openness of the country and its seemingly endless fields had a way of making me feel isolated, especially in the autumn months. During the summer, the tall fern-green stalks of corn and steamy soil gave the area an inviting vibrancy that helped fill this emptiness. The fall was much bleaker. Once the crops were harvested and the leaves had fallen off of the trees, the region took on an air of rot. That the remnants of the harvested stalks would dry and fade to the point where they finally resembled bleached bones did little to dispel this. One October, I headed up with my mom and dad for a visit. Of course, as someone who's always had an overactive imagination, the fact that the trip to her house was intermittently dotted with abandoned cemeteries did nothing to help my uneasiness. Apparently family plots, they would consist of a handful of sandstone grave markers eroding like wet sugar cubes into tangled grass. There was also the occasional ruined church among the stones. Unfortunately for me, besides these sightings and the unending farmland, there wasn't much to break up the drive. Reading in the car as always made me sick. Naturally, I was relieved when I felt the tires shift onto the rumbling gravel that covered my grandma's driveway. After stretching my legs from the trip, I walked over to give my grandmother, a short, blue-haired woman of about 70 at the time, a hug. We followed her into the house for dinner. My grandmother was an amazing cook, and I always made sure my mom got her recipes. That World War II generation really knew how to throw a stick of butter into mashed potatoes in a way that would blow your mind. There wasn't much to do at her house after dinner, so I volunteered to burn her trash. Now solidly in my tweens, I could be trusted with such responsibilities and took full advantage, since, like most boys that age, I fancied myself a bit of a pyro expert. As I dragged the bag of garbage out of the house, I noticed that it was already getting dark, and gray flannel clouds had silently filled up the sky. Having visited the area enough to know that rain was probably coming soon, I hurriedly dragged the bag to the metal drum my grandma used for burning trash and lawn waste. It was at the back corner of the lot, where the edges of her grass, faded and gloomy with the fall, met the ragged dirt of the fields. I threw the bag in and lit it in a few places. I watched it for a while before the rain began to come down, sprinkling. Deciding that the rain would be enough to keep the fire from spreading out of control, I went inside to the sound of rumbling thunder in the distance. Knowing that it was getting late, I began to get anxious with the thought of going to bed. I never slept well at my grandma's. As I said, I had an overactive imagination, and even in my secure suburban bedroom on the second floor of our home, I frequently had nightmares about what could be outside my home while I was in bed. My grandmother's entire home was a single-story bungalow. What was worse was that I usually slept in the breezeway, which I later discerned wasn't strictly a breezeway, but was more of a living room space between the garage and the house. It was separated from the house where my parents and grandmother slept by a short flight of stairs and a door. There were 3 other doors leading to the garage and front and back lawns. The room also had windows on every side, except where it bordered the garage. Other than the couch I slept on and a sink, there was nothing else in the room. I always felt very alone and isolated sleeping in there. I laid in bed for a couple hours and listened to it rain outside. After a while, I heard a train rumble by on the track across the street from the front lawn. I got off the couch and walked over to the window to watch it go by. It always made me feel uncomfortable how flimsy those single-pane windows were, like there was nothing separating you from the night. After the last car disappeared, I stood there looking out of the window for a bit. At this point, it dawned on me that the rain had stopped. I was somewhat upset with myself, since I had missed my best chance of having that soothing sound lull me to sleep. However, I could still hear the rumbles and flashes of a storm, and hoped that it was another one moving in, and not just the last one growing more distant. As my eyes continued to adjust, I noticed a flicker on the grass in the right side of my vision. Clearly the fire hadn't gone out in the back of the lawn, and I went to the rear breezeway window to check on it. Looking through the back window, it quickly became apparent to me that there had been more unburnt refuse in the drum than I'd thought, and the glow of the fire was casting spots of faint orange light along the lawn and fields. The light was reaching far into the night in that flat, dark country, and I noted with some dismay that the storm appeared to be moving south. As I watched the faint flashes of lightning exploding on the horizon, my eyes shifted back to the fields behind my grandmother's house. There was something moving on the edge of the light. My eyes were fairly well adjusted to the night at this point, and I gradually made it out. It was the form of a woman dancing in the field. Her movements weren't frantic. They were a bit closer to the way a ballerina moves, slowly dipping the torso, lifting the leg gracefully, bowing the arms over her head, and so on. I stood there petrified in silence. Her mere presence and peculiar movement would have been enough to frighten me. However, a distant flash of lightning consumed the entire field in a moment of pale white light, revealing that she was also completely naked. My hands gripped the windowsill. She slowly danced along the edges of the fire's orange light, never stepping more than a foot or an arm directly into it. It made me even more uncomfortable when I noticed that she was facing the house and appeared to be closer than she was when I first saw her. There had only been one lightning flash to illuminate the entire field, so it was difficult to tell at first. But as she drew nearer to the window from which I was watching, I began to realize that her skin was incredibly wrinkled. Despite the grace and effortlessness of her movements, her skin appeared to be ancient as it sagged off her limbs. Gradually, she quit edging around the borders of the light and reversed her dance movements back into the darkness. I pulled myself away from the window and buried my face into the couch. I spent the rest of that night trying to convince myself that it was a trick of shadows. I didn't get a wink of sleep that night, and I crashed around 6 or 7 a.m. when the sun came up. Even though I hadn't called for them the night before, my family knew how hard it was for me to sleep at my grandmother's and let me sleep in for a while. I was eventually woken up by my father, who informed me that my grandma's ladder was broken and we would need to go borrow one from my uncle Harley, who was actually my great-uncle, though I never referred to him as such. I smiled and rolled off the couch. I always enjoyed seeing my Uncle Harley and was quick to get ready to go despite my lack of sleep. I recall being quiet on the ride over to Harley's farm. Looking out onto the fields, I realized even if footprints had been left by the woman in the wet dirt, they would be nearly impossible to find in such a large field with so much debris left over from the harvest. Undecided as to whether that made me feel better or worse, I continued to watch the ruins of the cornstalks fly by along the roadside until the buildings of my uncle's farm came into view. My Uncle Harley was a pig farmer, and to this day it makes me smile when people invoke that profession derisively. My uncle was a successful businessman and farmer, owning a large factory-style farm. Though he didn't do any of the processing on the site, he did own several large feed silos next to the long metal barns which held the pigs. My uncle was a self-made man and veteran of both World War II and Korea, and reminded me a bit of Clint Eastwood. The man was tall and powerful even in his advanced age, and despite his stoic demeanor, he had a surprisingly sharp sense of humor. I could see him waving to us as we turned into his driveway. As I got out of the car, I noticed how strong the stench of the pigs was. It was a smell I was used to, and the surrounding area was fairly permeated with it, along with the other scents that colored air in farm country. I actually grew to be somewhat fond of the smell from the distance, as weird as that sounds, but it was overpowering up close. I flashed my uncle a smile, but covered my nose with my shirt as soon as he and my dad turned away from me towards the workshed where my uncle kept his ladders. I went over to the tire swing hanging from a tree on the opposite side of his house, and more importantly, upwind from the barns. When my uncle came back around the house with my dad carrying the ladder under one arm, I was standing on the swing with one foot in the tire and my hands grasping the rope connecting it to the tree. "You keep swinging around like that, and you're just going to stir up the smell," he yelled to me as I hopped off the swing. I was mildly embarrassed that he had keyed in on my distaste for the smell, but felt better when he conceded that the rain had made it worse than usual. We stayed a bit after picking up the ladder, but my dad wanted to get back to my grandma's before dark. We were only going to be there for a weekend, and he wanted to make sure we finished the work. When we got back, my dad had me hold the ladder as he scooped brown muck out of the gutter. I was so lost in thought looking out into the fields that I nearly dropped the ladder after a piece of the muck falling shocked me back into reality. I was only able to offer a feeble apology afterward, as my mind was still on the previous night and the faded orange on the horizon that indicated the night was coming. Not wanting to give my parents a reason to doubt my maturity or sanity, I didn't tell them about the night before. The reward for my bravery was another night in the breezeway. Unlike the night before, this one was completely cloudless, with a bright moon casting pale rays through the windows. I didn't figure I was in for much sleep, and just laid on my back in the couch, staring at the ceiling. I could hardly believe it when I heard the grandfather clock's Westminster chimes from across the house, followed by the bells denoting the hour. How clearly those low tones made their way through the air made me realize how silent the night had been, and let me know that it was already 2 in the morning. The drowsy formation of this thought was shattered by another sound, a faint sound, rustling from outside. The noise sent a chill down my spine, and I immediately snapped up to see that the window over the sink was cracked open. My mom or grandma must have opened it for ventilation during the day. Doing my best not to look out the window and stay beneath the window line above which someone could see me, I rolled off the couch and hugged closely to the sink. As my fingers crept up the wall, over the sill and onto the window, I heard another rustle, louder from the backyard. Out of my peripheral vision, I saw movement and felt a tear of frustration and fear trace down my cheek. I pulled the window shut, and as I did so, looked out the window to my left into the backyard. The woman was there, standing not 15 feet from the house and staring at me through the window. I was frozen, partly out of fear and partly out of a hope she didn't see me. After all, I was closing a window on nearly the opposite side of the room in the dead of night. Her body was facing away from me, and the skin on her back was hanging like melted wax. Her head was turned looking over her left shoulder to face the house, to face me. Her arms were spread out away from her body, and her palms were aimed in my direction. With the same grace that she had displayed the night before, she pivoted her body on one foot, turning to face the rear window. She slowly moved towards the house, her movements illuminated in the moonlight. It was then that I realized yet another horrible thing about this woman. Her skin wasn't just baggy, it was jointed. She looked like a rag doll that had been sewn together. It seemed like it was being held together from shedding in sections. The moon cast shadows over the eye sockets which didn't quite seem to fit her face. As she crept closer, I noticed her lips looked thin and cracked, and her breasts were dry and shriveled. Slowly she placed her hands on the frame of the window, and I made out the glint of 2 eyes in the shadows of those ill-shaped sockets. They were peering right at me with an intensity that cut right through the space between us. The shock of her looking into the house was enough to turn the squeaks caught in my throat into screams. I flopped onto the floor and scrambled backwards against the front door. I could hear my parents stirring in the house, and as their footsteps approached, the woman tilted her head back. Her face appeared to stretch into a howl, but it didn't seem like she could move her lips very far apart. I couldn't hear if she made a sound. She pirouetted and disappeared back into the night. I threw up in my lap as my parents came into the room. The next morning, my parents didn't prod me to talk about what I had seen. I'd explained it to them in jabbering fashion the night before as they helped me clean up. Eventually, I fell asleep with my mom sitting up next to me. I'd had a handful of night terrors when I was younger, and my parents chalked up my experience to that category. I said nothing to dispute this. Even though I didn't believe it, I hoped that I really had had a night terror, and that maybe that would explain what I had seen. My dad offered to let me stay at my grandma's as he returned the ladder he had borrowed from my uncle. Because I didn't want my family to worry about my state, I insisted on accompanying him. Besides, I figured getting out would help calm me down. However, as we drove, I imagined her behind every tree we passed, lurking in every drainage ditch. For the most part, I had laid back with my seat reclined, staring into nothing until we got to the farm. By the time we got there, I was feeling a bit better. Still, I decided to stay in the car as my dad went with my uncle to return the ladder to its shed. I didn't need the smell of those pigs upsetting my stomach further. As I was trying to put my thoughts elsewhere, I glanced into the rearview mirror and saw another vehicle coming down the driveway. It was a pickup. It pulled past me towards the barn. As my uncle and dad came around the house, the truck stopped and the driver got out. I was relieved that my uncle didn't appear concerned, but he did have a stern look on his face. He made a couple of steps towards the pickup and pointed the driver to the barn. The driver then walked over to the barn, slid the door to the side, and picked up the leash to a pig that had been tied to one of the pens. As he led the pig towards the pickup, my uncle and father kept walking towards the car. I opened the door to say hi. "That's Teddy," my uncle said. "He has a small farm, maybe a dozen pigs. Usually doesn't sell single hogs and sows. Started doing it a while ago to help him get started, and now it seems like he's coming by once every few weeks." "What's his problem?" my dad asked. My uncle laughed. "With the pigs or with everything else? Not sure in any case. He eats some, tries to breed others, I suppose. I don't talk with him much, just sell him a pig every now and then. He says he butchers his own meat." My dad looked over in the man's direction. "Is he trying to be self-sufficient?" "I guess. I try not to talk to him too much." "God damn it, Ted. Didn't I tell you not to do that here?" I looked away from my uncle and dad to see the man opening the hog's throat with a long knife. He had his arm around its side as its legs kicked around like it was being electrocuted. I couldn't believe how much blood spilled out from its neck and onto the ground. The man smiled weirdly at my uncle and then slung the pig's limp body into the bed of the truck. It was amazing how effortlessly he did it. The hog must have weighed at least a few 100 pounds. He pulled a tarp over the body before he closed the tailgate. The man turned and got into the driver's side of the car. Blood was dripping onto the ground from under the tailgate. My uncle sighed and looked at the ground, visibly pissed. "He doesn't have a proper trailer to move them around in, so sometimes he does that here to make it easier." Smiling up at me, he added, "Or sometimes he hog ties them." I laughed. Even though it wasn't a great joke, or even a joke at all really, since I'm sure that's exactly what he did, the way my uncle said it put a smile on my face. He pinched the bridge of his nose as the pickup drove by and waved with his other hand without looking at the man. The man barely looked at us, but I caught a glimpse of his eyes that made me shiver. We left for home fairly soon after getting back to my grandmother's, which was fine with me. I loved her, but I was ready to get out of there. I slept the whole ride home and tried to put the whole experience out of my mind as best I could. For years after that, I visited my grandma's without incident. On one particular visit, I picked up the local paper while I was in town. On the front page was the face of the man I had seen at the farm that day, Teddy. The memory of that story and the realization that came with it chills me even now as I recollect it. The man, who apparently was named Teddy Warden, had been in a car accident in his pickup. He was speeding through a stop sign on a country road in the early morning when a semi crushed in the passenger side of his truck. The pickup was sent spinning across the intersection, and flipped into a drainage ditch. By the time the driver of the semi got out to check on the other vehicle, Warden had already crawled out of the cab and was tearing across the field. Perplexed, the driver continued towards the flipped pickup, then fled back to his own semi to call for help. The tarp was draped out of the bed of the pickup, fully uncovering its spilled contents. Corpses and the parts of corpses were scattered in the mud. Later that day, the sheriff's office, with backup from a larger nearby city's police department, showed up at the man's house. They reported an overpowering stench from the outside building. Opening up the garage, they found the butchered and rotting skeletons of hogs. One hog was hanging upside down, field-dressed like a deer. They noted that it appeared as if he was slaughtering them and feeding them to the other pigs, as putrefying hog meat was found in the feed troughs. It was a matter they were forced to investigate in some detail after the horror they discovered inside. The officers were met by an intensified smell inside the house. The building was completely unlit, and I can only imagine how horrible it was for them to comb that house. The source of the smell wasn't the pigs, or at least wasn't just the pigs. Hanging from the walls were remnants of human bodies in various stages of decomposition. They weren't just hung on the wall as trophies either. The paper likely spared many of the details, but noted that there were several overturned skulls that appeared to be used as bowls. When the officers entered Warden's room, they found him rocking in his bed, hands at his side. He had skulls on the bedposts. The floor was apparently littered with the remains of corpses, and even though he made no reported attempt to resist arrest, it was apparently difficult to get Warden out through the darkness and clutter. Warden only howled as they removed him from the house. The writer noted that his home's distance from the road and Warden's known habit of transporting butchered animals in his truck had kept the signs of his activities hidden. As of the date of the paper's printing, those involved had discerned that the body parts had come from at least 38 separate individuals, though they were still in the process of sorting and identifying the remains. Initially, this confused investigators. Such a high number of disappearances would have been noticed in such a small town. However, the answer to their questions quickly became apparent through examination of the corpses and interviews with Warden. Many of the bodies were ancient, nearly fully decomposed. The investigators surmised that they had been stolen from graves, a conclusion that was later confirmed by Warden. While a few were identified as thefts from more recent burials, the majority of bodies had been stolen from abandoned cemeteries that sit by country roads, the disturbed earth obscured by the long grass. They will likely never discover the identities of many of these older corpses. Though the thought of Warden quietly absconding into the dead of night to an abandoned graveyard and stealing the long decomposing bodies interred therein is certainly chilling to me, the most unsettling part of the story involves how they found Warden in his house before they arrested him. When the officers discovered Warden in his bed, he was lying next to a woman's suit, carefully sewn together from the skin of the fresher corpses he had exhumed. Through interviews, the police had discovered that Warden would wear the suit and prowl the fields at night, using the seclusion afforded by the darkness and remoteness to live out his fantasy. The realization washed over me. All those years ago, I had seen him. He and I, alone in the darkness, separated by a flimsy window and a little bit of space. I was good with kids. I liked them, but they seemed to love me, so I ended up doing a lot of babysitting work when I was 17. Childcare, if you want to make it sound more professional on your resume. It was an easy way to make money, usually just by playing. I liked their weird little minds and the bizarre things kids would say, so it was fine by me. But after I babysat George, I stopped. George wasn't the problem. George was lovely. He was 6 and still had big, cute, chubby cheeks. The best thing was he mostly played on his own, and then all I would have to do was just keep an eye on him. I would read a book nearby while he got lost in his own world. Both his mom and dad had important jobs, and if the long hours they worked didn't show it, the size of their house did. It was 4 stories high, and the lawn in the garden stretched way back with different types of trees on each side. It was summer, and so I was looking after George most days during the school break. The weather was good, so we played outside a lot. Well, I kept an eye on him as he ran around, imagining adventures from the looks of it, or playing with his toys on the grass, marching his dinosaurs amongst the flowers. After a while, George always seemed to play in the same area at the end of the garden, next to one particular tree. It was the tallest tree in the yard, a big, thick oak with roots that came out of the ground like varicose veins. I just guessed that was his favorite spot. I noticed he started using the name Jack in a lot of his games. Then he started to look as if he was talking to someone. I'd never had an imaginary friend myself, or looked after a kid who had one before. I didn't know much about child psychology then either, but as he was an only child with workaholic parents, it made sense to me at the time. One afternoon, the clouds were becoming darker, and it looked like it was about to pour down, so I called George to come inside. He angrily said that he didn't want to, because he was playing with Jack. It took me by surprise. This was the most disobedient I'd ever heard George be. I kept my calm and asked, "Why don't you and Jack both come inside then?" George said Jack couldn't come inside because he was tied to the tree. I put on my stern voice and furrowed my eyebrows, something I hadn't had to do with George until then, and firmly told him to come inside. He looked back at the tree, nodded, and then dutifully marched in. Later that day, it occurred to me that George only said the name Jack when he was near his favorite tree. Later, when George was eating the banana sandwiches I made him for lunch, I asked him why Jack was tied to the tree. He said that he had hurt one of the maids, so the master had tied him to a tree as punishment. I thought maybe he'd been in the same room with his parents, watching Downton Abbey or something. I think I still only found it interesting at this point, even funny. Kids and their imaginations, right? After that, I noticed that George had started to whisper to Jack. When George had played with Jack before, it always used to seem like fun, but now it seemed different. I would strain my ears to hear, but I couldn't make out what George was whispering. I asked him what he was talking about with Jack, and he would just answer,
Nothing at all.
Something about the rhythm and how he said it felt wrong, like it was just being parroted back, but I thought he could have picked it up from a movie or anywhere. Not long after, I had to use that stern voice with George again.
I found him rooting around under the kitchen sink, in the cupboard where the bleach and all the other poisonous bottles were. He claimed he was after the saws. Hacksaws, coping saws, and a handsaw. My mind whirled like I was on a drunk carousel while I tried to make sense of it. He'd made a pile of the saws next to him on the tile. He looked up at me, and his eyes widened when he recognized the horror on my face. The horror, which was quickly turning to anger. Then I really shouted at him. "What the hell are you doing? You mustn't ever mess with these things. They are very dangerous. This is such a naughty thing to do." Those sorts of things. I felt my own parents' discipline from years ago channeling through me. He looked up at me all the while with his bottom lip wobbling, and when I finally had finished, he burst into tears. I hugged him and told him it was just because I was so worried, and that he was a good boy, really. He said that he had just wanted to help Jack. I didn't know what to do. I was no therapist, but I thought, hell, if I played along with it, maybe I could stop anything like this from happening again. "Did Jack ask you to help him?" George didn't say anything. "Why don't I talk to Jack?" "No!" George's eyes widened. "Why not? I just want to explain to him how he got you in trouble. Then he won't ask you to do it again." "No, don't. He's my friend." I didn't like how stubborn he was being, and not just because he was being difficult. He wasn't usually like this. He seemed scared. If he is your friend, then he'll understand. I turned and started to walk to the garden. George followed behind me. I reached the tree and positioned myself looking at the place where I guessed the invisible child might be, and ignored my feelings that this was ridiculous. "Jack, I know you wanted George to help you, but he mustn't go near the saws or tools because it's dangerous and he'll get into trouble. So I'm sorry, but he just can't help you." I turned to George. "Okay, now I think we should go in." I stopped in shock as I felt a sharp pain in the back of my leg. It felt like something had pinched me. I immediately looked back, but there was nothing. Something felt bad, like the air pressure around us had dropped. And when I turned back to George, he looked like he was about to cry. "Let's go inside," I said flatly, and held his hand. The weather outside turned bad for the rest of the week, so we stayed inside. Whatever had caused that pinching feeling had made a mark, but I reasoned with myself that it was more likely an insect bite. A nasty one. Maybe. There was an old photograph I'd walked past nearly 100 times, framed and hung in the hallway of the house. I'd never stopped and properly looked at it before. It was a picture of the house staff from 1898. Amongst the butlers, cooks, and maids, there was a little boy. It might have been the contrast, or saturation from the old-fashioned photography, but his eyes seemed dark and unpleasant. My eyes ached as I focused on him for too long, as if I was waiting for him to move. I tore myself away from the picture and went to find George. 3 days later, I was tidying up when I found a kitchen knife in George's toy box. It was the biggest one from the knife block. My heart jerked like a car crash collision. I marched back into the living room, and George looked up from where he was playing on the floor. "You come with me right now," I yelled, my voice wavering and failing at every point. He followed behind me as I stomped back to the playroom. "What the hell do you think you're doing with—" I looked down, and the knife wasn't there. It was gone. I started to dig through the toys, clawing through the bears and cars, but I couldn't find it. Pain burst and spread up the back of my leg, and I snapped back up straight. I turned around just in time to see the knife hit the floor like it had been dropped. George jumped from the noise of the crash the knife made as it landed about 2 meters away from him, between us. We both didn't say anything. I felt blood trickling down the back of my leg. George burst into tears. He fought against his own sobs and managed to bawl out his words.
I'm so sorry. I let him free. I shouldn't have done it. I helped Jack get free from the tree. I shouldn't have. I'm so sorry. He's a nasty boy. He's a nasty boy. I'm sorry.
I grabbed George. I grabbed his coat, grabbed my bag, and took him straight through the front door. His dad was incredibly ticked off that he had been dragged out of a meeting and called back home from work to find us sitting on the porch steps. I think he thought I wasn't noticing his eyes rolling, as I couldn't explain properly what happened. I was definitely meant to notice the dirty look he gave me when George started crying that he didn't want to go back inside the house ever again. That's when I left. I walked away down their gravel path and didn't look back as I heard George start wailing. I didn't ever go back to look after George. I was pretty sure they wouldn't have wanted me back after how unstable I must have seemed. I declined any other offers of work from other parents. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel guilty for leaving George. It definitely weighed heavy on my thoughts over the weeks and months, and then years. It didn't get easier to not remember sometimes, but I couldn't forget. At the time, I didn't admit it to myself, but looking back, it was 100% of the reason that my choices led to me getting a degree in child psychology at the university, and now I'm doing particularly well in the field. My secret personal penance of sorts. I thought I might get some closure on it all, when one day I had a familiar patient assigned to me at his parents' request. This was unusual, but when the boy walked into my office, 8 years older now, I understood. He doesn't want to be called George anymore, though. He only answers to Jack. I asked him where George is. He said he's tied to the tree. I remember seeing the house for the first time. I was a child of 7. My young parents had just bought their first home. I remember how much I used to hate living in the cramped, dingy apartment we previously inhabited, and opened the doors to our new home with wide-eyed wonder. It blew my young mind how spacious this house was. I went upstairs to scope out my new bedroom. I was so excited that I was getting my own room and did not have to share one with my infant brother. On my grand tour of my new digs, I finally made it down to our basement. The basement was nothing like the rest of the house. The upstairs was elegant and classy. The basement was cold, metallic, sterile and stinky. The ceiling was lined with ancient pipes winding in grotesque angles. The floor was covered in rough cement. I recall taking a look at the stairs for the first time and being immediately struck with how odd they were. The stairs were surrounded by drywall, which clashed with the rest of the basement. One particular section of the wall was colored differently than the rest. It stood out like a sore thumb.
I inched close to it and felt the texture of it. It felt very strange. I then knocked on it. A hollow sound pervaded the empty air of that basement. Something about that sound immediately put me ill at ease. I walked up the stairs as I could hear that same hollow sound echo in the emptiness of the basement. As we settled into our new home, I began to get comfortable with my surroundings. The house began to feel familiar, everywhere that is, except for the basement. It just always put me off, and I avoided going down there as best I could. Our family couldn't be happier. My loving father and mother doted over me and my little brother. My life was perfect. Then it began. I would hear strange, errant noises. When I pointed it out to my parents, they told me the old standby, that the house was settling in. One night in particular indicated that something wasn't right. I snuck downstairs to the kitchen for a late-night snack. As I closed the refrigerator, I heard a tapping sound cut through the silence of the night. I craned my head to see if I could pinpoint where the sound was coming from. Dread began to wash over me as I realized that tapping was coming from the basement. I inched my way over to the basement door. I opened it to see the blackness of the depths below. My ears perked up. There it was again, that hollow tapping sound. The same sound I had heard on my initial visit to the basement from hitting the drywall. I turned on the lights, steeling myself to go down the stairs and investigate. The tapping continued as I took the first step. Fear overtook me. I ran back to my bedroom and hid under my covers until the morning light gave way to a new day. I remember walking down the stairs. Being the first one up and about, I ran to the living room to play Nintendo. On my way, I passed the door to the basement. It was shut. Though I was in a state of near panic when I ran from it the previous night, I distinctly remember leaving the door open and not turning off the lights. I rationalized that my mother or father must have gone down there for some reason and lost myself in Super Mario Bros. 3. Later, I mentioned the incident to my parents, and they just assured me that what I'd heard was the sound of the hot water heater clicking in the night. I knew better, but welcomed a logical explanation. About a month after the move, my mother asked me to run downstairs and grab a load of socks out of the dryer that were in the basement. I reluctantly told her I would. It was the middle of the day and enough time had passed to dull the fear I had felt the week prior. I turned on the lights. I ran down the stairs. Hearing the hollow sound echo with my footsteps, a cold sweat started to form on me. The smell hit my nose as I reached the last step. My parents had mentioned that a mouse must have died and assured me they would find it. I made my way to the dryer and grabbed a basket. I pulled the socks out hastily and shoved them into the basket. After I shut the door to the dryer, I surveyed my surroundings. The stillness of the basement was so eerie. Then I heard it. A faintly audible whisper. At first I thought it was somebody calling from upstairs, their voice scarcely making it down to the basement. However, this was not the case. That sound was coming from the basement, specifically from under the stairs. As I stood frozen with fear, it began to increase in volume, but still remained barely above the threshold of human perception. what was being said incomprehensible to my young ears. Then it stopped as quickly as it began. I moved towards the stairs, keeping my eye on the oddly colored portion of the drywall. As I took my first step to escape this ever-growing nightmare, the most profoundly terrifying moment of my life occurred. A loud, hollow banging shook the stairs, almost knocking me to the ground. I ran up the stairs as fast as my legs would carry me. Through tears and shaking uncontrollably, I told my parents what had happened. They tried their best to calm me, but nothing they said could ease my mind. I told them in no certain terms I would never go down to the basement again. They must have been convinced of how terrified I was because they honored my request and never sent me down there again. After another 3 months in the house, things returned to normalcy for me, and honestly, there was about a 2-week period where I was happy again. This would be the last time happiness would exist in my life or my family's. One moment in particular comes to mind. I remember lifting up little Jonathan above my head as his pacifier fell out of his mouth and brushed against my nose. I pulled him in for a big bear hug and remember how he smelled. That wonderful smell that only babies emit. I was so content. It all came crashing down for me and my parents the night of July 2nd, 1991. That is the day Jonathan went missing. A ransom note was scrawled in barely legible English and left in his bed demanding $20,000 in cash. It informed my parents that if they contacted the police, they would kill little Jonathan. My mother and father took to their room and argued loudly and emotionally over whether or not to call the police, as I listened with tears streaming down my face. My mother eventually wore my father down, and the police were called. Seeing as the location of the drop and time were indicated on the note, the police set up a wiretap just in case the kidnapper decided to call. I remember asking my parents and the police if they had thoroughly searched through the house in case he was still there. They assured me they had, and that Jonathan would be fine after the drop. But the seed of an idea was already growing in my mind. It would blossom throughout the rest of my life. My parents followed the instructions to a T. They dropped off the money and then waited in the location that they were supposed to pick up Jonathan. He never came. Needless to say, this tore my family apart. As the weeks passed and there was no news about Jonathan, my young, vibrant parents became husks of their former selves. My mother especially. She blamed herself for getting the police involved and believed that to be the reason Jonathan was not returned. One night, as she was sobbing alone in shambles clutching a bottle of wine, I finally decided to divulge to her the theory that had been brewing inside my skull. I told her that I thought it was whoever, or whatever for that matter, was under the stairs that had gotten Jonathan, and maybe he was still alive. She slapped me across my face so hard that I saw stars. She screamed at me, the guilt expressing itself as rage. She told me to stop the childish crap and just accept that Jonathan was taken out of the house by some sick person and was dead. My childhood died that day. I remember contemplating taking a hammer and exposing whatever was under the stairs myself, but the fear of childhood was just too overwhelming for me to actually do it, let alone step one stair down into that basement again. My family moved shortly after the incident. I remember looking to the future with what might resemble optimism, only to have it come crashing down yet again. My parents divorced. The grief was too much to share, and not a year after that my mother killed herself. The guilt must have just overwhelmed her. My father did his best to raise me, but Jonathan's long shadow always hung over our lives. 20 years later, I began to think long and hard about my little brother's disappearance and how angry it made me. My family had a chance at a normal and fulfilling life, and it was snuffed out in an instant by whoever took him. I wasn't just robbed of a little brother, I was robbed of a chance of happiness. As I grew up, I accepted the official story of what happened. But lately, curiosity began to get the better of me. I began to drive past the old house. Seeing that it was currently vacant, ideas began to swirl in my head. I broke into the house one night bolstered by alcohol. I decided to do it, knowing I would likely find nothing under the basement stairs, but hoping that this would close a too long chapter in my life and allow me to finally move on. To my dismay, the stairs sounded exactly the same as I remember they did. A hollow sound pervading the emptiness of the basement. I stared at the spot in the drywall, still discolored, still just as ominous as it was when I was a child. However, the fear was not going to stop me this time. In fact, I was feeling the opposite. I was feeling a courage I hadn't felt in a long time. The moment of truth was upon me. With all the force within me emboldened by years of pent-up rage, I ran towards the wall shoulder first. The drywall came crashing down around me. I opened my eyes as my bravery was immediately eroded and turned into absolute horror. My God! Bones. Bones everywhere. My horror increased to unimaginable heights as I surveyed the tight space, seeing the myriad of skeletons strewn about. The light played menacingly off their tiny white frames. Tattered pieces of paper were strewn about with God only knows what written on them. There must have been the remains of 20 or 30 children. My fright reached a crescendo when I realized that with no exceptions, they were all missing their skulls. One particular tiny skeleton begged for my attention. I became weak in the knees and fell backwards when I saw what were unmistakably bite marks up and down the tiny forearm. As I hit the ground, I expected to hear a dull thud as I landed on the concrete. Instead, I heard a hollow sound. I looked to see what I had landed on. A trap door. Finding new courage, summoning strength I didn't know I had, I opened it. Below me lay a dark tunnel, a crawl space that could barely fit a person lying on their stomach. The dank smell wafting upward made me reluctant, but I knew what I had to do. Before I was conscious of what my muscles were doing, I found myself crawling through the darkness toward whatever lay on the other side. As I reached the end of the tunnel, I looked up to see a sliver of light cutting through the darkness. With trepidation, I pushed onwards. Cautiously, I poked my head up. To my surprise, the tunnel led to the other side of the stairs. I crawled out to find myself in the corner of the basement, facing the stairs behind a dryer covered in years of dust. The implications of all of this sent my mind reeling, but before I could form a coherent thought, the lights turned off in the basement. My heart caught in my throat as I began to hear someone descending the stairs. Slow but sure footsteps announcing I was no longer alone. With every thud, my heart skipped a beat. I began to hear that incomprehensible whispering, the familiarity raining the fear and woe of my lost childhood. Worrying the darkness would not adequately hide me, I sought cover by ducking behind the dryer, not willing to take the risk of catching a glimpse, though every fiber of my being screamed to do so. Panic began to set in. What was I going to do when he, or it, discovered his lair had been revealed? While I was mulling over my options, the screaming began. I say scream as a frame of reference, but there is no way to truly describe the guttural noises I heard. The sound smashing the silence of the basement was so bone-chilling, so surreal as to defy description. He clearly had discovered his perverse sanctuary had been disturbed. Before I knew it, I was running up the stairs for my life. I made it to my car too scared to turn around. With all muscles working in concert, I opened the door and put the key into the ignition in one swift movement. As my car sprang to life under the street light, a shadow fell on my car. I gunned it, never once looking back, flooring the accelerator to the local police precinct. I breathlessly tried to explain to the attending officer what had occurred and collapsed onto the floor in mid-sentence. Now it is a month later. The next day after my discovery, the police launched an investigation and quickly made the same gruesome discovery as I had. I was thanked profusely by the police and the community for what I had found, telling me that they were going to be able to close the books on multiple missing person cases. However, they were not able to find the perpetrator of these heinous crimes. They began to test the DNA of the bodies. A profound sense of relief overcame me when I received a call informing me that one of the tiny skeletons belonged to my brother Jonathan. I shared the news with my father. The look of relief on his face tugged at my heart. The burden he had carried for so many years was lifted. We hugged as tears filled both our eyes. However, the relief has been short-lived. The thing that keeps me up at night is whoever or whatever did this is still out there. The question that plagues my mind is whether or not this monster is literal or figurative. Either way, I hope I will never find out. You can dismiss this as the paranoid ramblings of a senile old Yankee, but I'm writing to you today with a warning. It's not a winter storm like they said it was. I awoke last Tuesday at 7:30 a.m. to the sounds of my alarm clock radio. It's always set to a local station. I just about lost my patience for national news a couple of years back. Maybe it's something about getting old, but my world started to shrink when I hit 50, and I let it. I've never been one to lend an ear to world affairs, or any affairs outside my home state of Massachusetts, for that matter. I lived a quiet life as a fisherman at the docks in my town, spending weeks at a time out at sea every year. All around, I've spent every calendar day at sea at some point in my life, even Christmas. I've seen storms so fearsome that the pounding rain turned to bitter snow in front of my eyes, a rarity at sea. I've felt waves so large that they keep me awake even now, 20-odd years later. Right as I'm on the precipice of sleep, they threaten to pull me back to consciousness, just as they almost pulled me back out to sea. Forgive an old man and his ramblings, but all of this to say that I thought I knew what to expect when I heard the radio newscaster say, "Batten down, folks. Another winter storm coming later this week." As I wiped the sleep from my eyes,
I half listened to the newswoman's lengthy list of preparation tips before smacking the off button and swinging my legs over the side of the bed, joints and floorboards creaking in unison. That was 8 days ago. Every day leading up to the storm, I've woken to broadcasts about its effects, and every day the messaging has become less and less clear. Wednesday, it was the winter storm Riley will cause even more damage than last week's storm. Thursday, it was, "Cancel all your plans for Friday and Saturday, folks. The state advises all residents to stay in their homes until after the storm." Friday morning, I woke up with a jolt to the grating beeps of the statewide emergency alert system. I turned on my TV, which can usually be relied on to get at least a few channels. Not Friday. Friday, every screen was blank, except for a red banner at the bottom with the words, "State of emergency declared for coastal region of southern Massachusetts. Do not attempt to flee your homes," moving across repeatedly, all the while accompanied by that same grating 3-beep cycle. My stomach fluttered with uneasiness as I read the message a second time and fully grasped the choice of words. Flee? Why would a whole town flee at the thought of some wind and snow? We're nor'easters ourselves, after all. I put my robe on and made my way down the stairs to my back door, expecting the fearsome gales and pelting snow that I had come to expect from a life at sea. Instead, I opened the door to an eerie, permeating quiet. The coastline cacophony that served as the constant background for my life here, the screaming of gulls and crashing of waves and howling of wind, was utterly gone, and in its place was a silence so complete that it caused the back of my neck to prickle with a deep and foreboding sense of wrong. The sky was devoid of the heavy, foreboding gray clouds that the newscasters had promised, instead featuring a consistent blanket of greenish-gray fog above the sea. I hurriedly closed the door, amplifying the distant sound of the 3 blaring beeps from my TV upstairs. I put a kettle of water on the stove before heading upstairs to get dressed, the uneasiness in my gut turning into an incessant gnawing as I turned to switch off the TV. The emergency alert at the bottom of the screen had changed to read, "Do not leave your home. Do 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 not leave your home." Underneath my feet, the kettle began to shriek as the beeping of the television reached a heightened pitch. "Do not leave your home. Do 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 not leave..." The television screen turned black with a pop, shutting down in coordination with my lights. A few seconds later, a sound with twice the force of a foghorn blast and the same thunderous intensity as a train blasting past roared over my head from the sea towards the mainland. A flash of green lit up the dim sky, for a second illuminating the utter stillness from before. I waited in my house for 38 minutes before the noise and rumbling came thundering past from the town back towards the sea. That was 5 days ago. The power came back on as soon as the noise was gone, as did the howl of the wind and crashing of the waves. But it's what happened during those 38 minutes that caused the gnawing in my gut to persist. They're saying the power outages were caused by heavy winds, but I don't buy it. I saw photos of the storm online, complete with heavy snow and wind-battered houses. That might be from some other town, but it sure as hell isn't from mine. We have no coastal flooding, no infrastructural damages, and no houses blown out to sea. What we have is thousands and thousands of dead birds. We have water that tastes like copper. We have bloated fish carcasses washing up on our beaches. I'm writing this today as a warning. I don't know what the hell happened last week, but I'm sure as hell it isn't what they said it was going to be. If you're in the Northeast, take special care. And if they tell you not to leave your homes, you do well to listen. I'm telling you this today as a warning, because today I woke up at 7:30 a.m. to the words,
Winter Storm Quinn, set to break later this afternoon. Expected to cause even more damage than Riley.
Generally dry day on Wednesday with sunny periods. However, there may be more cloud in the southeast where it will be breezier. After a chilly start, it will be mostly dry on Thursday with some sunny spells. However, it may be rather cloudy in the southeast.
On March 15th, 2018, I received the phone call that changed my life. It was from a man named Chris Bailey. He told me that he was the duly appointed coroner of Gilliman, Colorado. He said that he had bad news.
I'm calling in regard to a Mr. Brian Hope. My brother? Yes, sir. Are you sitting down? Yes, We found your brother in his motel room this morning. I regret to inform you that your brother passed away last night. We are still investigating, but the cause of death appears to be natural. Natural? Yes, sir. We have reason to believe he had a heart attack in his sleep. I'm so sorry for your loss.
That's what he said. So sorry for your loss. As if sorry made up for it. As if I could forgive him. As if I could forgive the world. Well, I couldn't. I wouldn't. And I still won't. My brother was everything to me. He was my protector, my mentor, my friend. He was just 2 years older than me, but it always seemed like more than that. Brian was an old soul. We grew up in Gilliman, Colorado. It was the kind of town that was just small enough for you to recognize everybody else's face, but not small enough for you to know their name. For 2 precocious young boys, it was a comfortable, if somewhat plain, place to grow up. Our world was one of summer days spent playing in the woods, winter nights spent hoping for snow days, and year-long suburban hijinks. When I think back to my childhood, I remember the good times with my brother. Once, Brian and I were riding razor scooters down the hill at the bottom of our street, and we crashed into each other. Brian had a nasty cut on his forehead, but he still spent the next week pampering me and helping me tend to my road rash. All he cared about was whether I was okay. He was almost like a second father to me. Our actual father disappeared when we were young, under mysterious circumstances. It was very sudden, and it threw our family for a loop. Our mom did her best, but she was never cut out for being a single mother. When I was 10, we left Gilliman. After that, we moved across the country a bunch. My mom was always looking for work, mostly because she got fired from every job she had. She was a little slow and enjoyed her evening martinis a little too much. She used to joke that she shouldn't have taken my father's name, Hope, because ever since she did, it was the only hope she had left. That joke was pretty funny until I was 13. Around that time, she drank herself stupid and wandered onto a highway in the middle of the night. They said the guy that hit her was high on some manufactured drug, but I don't blame him too much. It was partly her fault for getting plastered and wandering away like that. Still, it was rough after she was gone. Rest in peace, Mom. Hope you're happier now, wherever you are. Shortly after Dr. Bailey called, I received an email containing a copy of Brian's autopsy report. It confirmed what Dr. Bailey suspected. Brian's heart gave out. One too many cheeseburgers, I guess. Brian had certainly put on the pounds in his later years. Work had gotten pretty stressful for him, for both of us really. Brian is, or was, an editor of the local rag, a paper called the Humboldt Gazette. It's no Times, just a mid-sized operation, but he practically carried it on his back. That's why he had gone back to Gilliman. He wanted to take a break from the hustle and bustle of the city. He wanted to relax for a while and enjoy the country life. He told me that he had fond memories of the time we spent there as kids. He also told me that Gilliman was a funny place, the kind that always sticks in the back of your head. I've always wanted to go back, see the house we lived in when Dad was still around, see if anybody remembers him. That's what Brian said before he booked his plane ticket to fly out there. He didn't say what I knew he meant. He wanted to go back and see if he could find out what happened to Dad. Brian had always said he was curious about it. He always said that it didn't make sense that he would just up and leave us like that. Mom hadn't started drinking until after he disappeared. As far as we knew, they had a happy marriage. Mom never made us think differently. It always bothered me, Roger. Maybe he's still out there. Maybe I could find him, make him explain why he abandoned us like that. Brian was the most determined man I ever met. After Mom died, Brian took care of me. He dropped out of school so he could work 2 jobs. I tried to drop out too, but he wouldn't let me. He said I had to make grades so I could get into a good college. So I worked my ass off. I got the grades. I got a good scholarship. Brian was proud as crap of me. The day I got my acceptance letter to NYU, he was so happy. That afternoon, he bought me my first beer, and we watched baseball on TV. The Rockies lost, but I'll remember that beer forever. That first beer led me to try a second, and that second led me to a third, and before I knew it, it was finals time for my first semester of college, and I was spending every night chugging cheap beer or cheaper whiskey. Brian wrote me letters telling me that he was so proud of me, telling me that I was going to make the world a better place. Stupid Brian. He didn't even know his brother was a hopeless alcoholic failure. I was too much of a screw-up to pass a single class. I didn't even go to most of my finals. College, it wasn't right for me. I dropped out after that semester. Brian was mad at first, but I think he realized I just wasn't ready for the real world. We both got jobs. He spent his days at a construction site, and I spent my nights as a mall security guard. Neither job was particularly fulfilling. Brian was so exhausted that most nights he passed out in front of the TV as soon as he got home from work. My job wasn't a lot better. Late-night security consists mainly of trying not to fall asleep and watch the clock hands traverse their usual path. I spent a lot of those nights writing bad poetry and worse short stories. We lived in a crappy apartment, drank crappier beer, and watched even crappier baseball. Over time, Brian got his stuff together. He got his GED. He got a degree from a community college. Then he got a bachelor's from Northwestern in journalism. Brian was a smart son of a gun. He got a big job doing investigative reporting for the Times. I stayed in our small apartment, working crap jobs and drinking. Sooner or later, we got old. Brian started his own newspaper with a buddy. They hired me on as a lifestyle journalist. Even if I couldn't make it through a year at NYU, I could still pen a few words about local animal shelters and massage parlors. After a few years, Brian got tired. You could see it in the bags under his eyes. He had been working so hard for so long. Everybody told him to relax, to take some time off. Brian listened. He took a trip to Gilliman. And then I got the call from Dr. Bailey. Just like that. The man who had given me so much was taken away from me. Dr. Bailey said he would arrange for the body to be sent to us in a freezer truck, so I could arrange a proper funeral. Brian's business partner and I made all of the arrangements. Planning a funeral isn't as hard as it used to be. Nowadays, you tell them your price range. They try to make you spend more. You say no, thank you, and then you're on your way. I'd be lying if I told you that I was okay. My stomach still feels like it's full of 100 twisting worms. It's hard to eat or sleep. I always thought that Brian would be there forever. Suddenly, he isn't there to talk to when I'm bored. There is no one to call when I want to complain about the damn Rockies or my newest column. I'm alone. Sure, I have friends, but nobody like Brian. His body arrived 3 days after the coroner called. I saw it myself. We put it in the ground a few days later. Almost 100 people RSVP'd to the funeral. The man was beloved by all. I'm sure it was a great service, but I didn't go because Brian wasn't dead. The night before the funeral, I was working late in the office, both because I had to make up for all the work Brian wasn't doing anymore, and because if I wasn't working, I didn't have to go home and face the lonely feeling in my head. Anyway, I was going through the submissions we get from readers. Usually it's just spam and fan letters from creepy people that have become obsessed with one of our reporters. But this time, I found something unusual. A small white envelope. On the outside of the envelope was black Sharpie that read, "Roger the coroner is wrong." I tore it open in an instant. A little strip of paper fell out. There were 2 sets of characters written on it in a messy script. The first was a web address. The second was a very short message. Brian Hope, Gray, 3/15/18. I pulled up the address on my computer immediately. It brought me to a plain black web page with a video player and a preloaded clip. As soon as the website loaded, the video began to play. The footage is approximately 3 minutes long. It was horrible. I'm going to describe it, but be warned, it is not for the faint of heart. The video is shot in a small gray room. I wish I could provide more description than that, but I can't. There are no fixtures on the walls. There's something off about the room, though. It's almost like the floors and walls are moving. They look almost like they're made of TV static. Although the room appeared dimly lit, I didn't see any fixtures. There isn't even a door as far as I could see. There is, however, a table in the middle of the room. The table is covered by a dishwater colored. Lying on top of that sheet is my brother. He is wearing only a discolored pair of boxer shorts. There are shackles on his wrists and ankles that lead underneath the table, out of view. He's alive. When the video starts, he is screaming. The camera moves towards his chest, and you can see that his pale skin is stained with sticky, crimson blood. The video pans over to the source of the blood. It appears that the nipple on the left side of his chest has been ripped off. A little bit of it is still hanging from the areola. Brian keeps screaming.
No more. Please stop.
The shot cuts out for a second and then cuts to a figure standing in front of the table. It's standing near his legs and appears to be surveying him. Brian is still screaming. The figure is near silhouetted by the strange lighting in the room. It's hard to make out any of its features. It looks just like a gray mass in a loose humanoid shape. As the camera pans the figure, you can see Brian's hands. They too are bloody, a result of having had most of the fingernails taken off. There is a loud buzzing noise in the background, like the sound of white noise. The figure holds up an object. Unlike the body of the figure itself, the object is easy to see in the light. It's a hammer. Its tip is covered in dried blood. Brian screams as the figure raises the hammer above its head. The shot cuts out before the hammer collides with Brian's kneecap. The screen stays black for a few seconds and then cuts to a shot on the wall. This is the shot that made me think it was like static electricity. As the camera pans to the right, it feels like I'm looking at dead air. But then, the camera comes to a framed picture. It's not so much hanging from the wall as it's floating in front of it. The framed picture is familiar, although I haven't seen it for almost 15 years. It's a photo of my family, my mom, my dad, Brian and me, all from when I was only 2 years old. We used to hang this picture above the fireplace, except the photo has been altered. Someone has scribbled over Brian and my father's faces with a black marker. After a moment of focusing on this photograph, Brian is heard screaming in the background. He yells,
Please stop. Somebody help. Please.
Then, for just a moment, the video cuts to his face. It is entirely gray and expressionless. In that moment, the buzzing noise was deafening. Then the video shut off. As soon as it ended, the website crashed. The link no longer displays the video. Now, it just goes to an unknown domain. None of this makes sense. The autopsy report didn't mention any of the injuries depicted in the video. Hell, I saw the body. It wasn't mangled at all. But the person in the video was Brian. I recognized the scar on his forehead where he fell off from his scooter way back when. The date listed on the envelope is from the day Dr. Bailey called me. The body Dr. Bailey sent me isn't my brother. When the coroner called, Brian was still alive. Maybe still is. Last night, I dreamt about the face I saw in the video. I dreamt that I was running through the woods I used to play in as a child. I was being chased.
When I looked over my shoulder, I saw that face. It was faster than me. It caught me. When its gray hand touched my skin, it felt like my blood was boiling. When I woke up, there was a buzzing in my ears. It sounded just like the noise in the video. Whatever that face is, it was telling me something. I know it was. It was sending a message with that video. It's telling me that it's time to go back to Gilliman. It's time to go home.